Okay, are you seeing that okay, Brittany? Okay, great. So thanks everyone for attending this series. This is the second time that I've had the pleasure to give a talk at this series, and I really appreciate it. Tonight I'm going to be talking about one of our restoration projects that we're doing for the Nature Conservancy in Ohio. We're doing restoration for the Blazing Star Borer Moth, which is a rare moth in both Michigan and Ohio. And yes, I do work for the Ohio chapter, but we do work in the oak openings region, which spans across both Michigan and Ohio, and I'll talk more about that. So I'll just jump right into it. I'm going to give you a little background on the oak openings region first, because I think it really needs some context. The oak openings region is a 1,300 square mile area that stretches from northwest Ohio into southeast Michigan. It's in 2 counties in Ohio and 4 counties in Michigan. And it stretches roughly from just southwest of Toledo up and into the area in between Ann Arbor and Detroit. Now on this map, with this polygon designating the oak openings region, it looks like it's one big region and that's it. But the reality is that the oak openings region is more spotty than this, and it's very tough to find all the locations that there might be oak openings habitats. But in general, one thing that's very common among oak openings habitats are these sandy soils. Left over from the last glacial period. So I'll talk more about that. But again, it's not just one big whole polygon. It's kind of a mosaic. One thing also to remember about this area is that it's right next to Lake Erie, and it's also right next to the Maumee River right here. So what we do in the oak openings region impacts water quality in the streams and rivers in the region, and then those streams and rivers flow out into the Maumee River and into Lake Erie. So maintaining good water quality is important for the lakes and rivers of the region. The oak openings is considered a very important location and region. It's a biodiversity hotspot. It's in the Ohio portion of the oak openings region. It's got the highest concentration of biodiversity in the state of Ohio. It's also got a very high rate of biodiversity in Michigan. There are over 150 rare species that are state or federally listed in the oak openings region. It's got globally imperiled natural communities that I will talk more about, but that are found nowhere else on Earth. And we're really privileged actually to live in this region and to still have some of these remnant populations left, and we're trying to restore some of them. As I mentioned, the water quality benefits in the oak openings region also benefit the rivers in the surrounding region and Lake Erie. Maintaining good sediment control and good pollution control also it can be done with, it manages stormwater. So maintaining these areas with good healthy root systems will control our water and will reduce flooding and erosion and pollution going into Lake Erie. And it also contributes to our quality of life. There are species like the ones pictured at the bottom that find nowhere else. Well, some of these are found outside the oak openings region, but they're perhaps they're at their highest density in this region. Things like the blue spotted salamander, the Karner blue butterfly, and the spotted turtle. And just the fact that we have open spaces still to enjoy wildlife and enjoy recreating in. It's not just for the wildlife, it's for people too. Now, speaking of rare species, one of the ones that we're spending a lot of time thinking about and working on is the Blazing Star Borer Moth. This is a species that is listed as a species of concern in Michigan and listed as endangered in Ohio. Now, part of the reason for this is it's a very rare moth. We don't know much about it. We're working with Michigan State the Michigan State Extension Service, and specifically the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, to do surveys of these moths and figure out what their distribution is and how common they are. But what I can tell you is they're rare, and that they're also kind of an indicator species. And if you can create good habitat for the Blazing Star Borer Moth, you can also create good habitat for a lot of other species as well. And I'll talk about our restoration methods for this in a bit. So just going back and describing a little bit more about what the oak openings are. The oak openings were created because of when the last glacial period occurred, well, actually a series of glacial periods that began around 55,000 years ago, when glaciers over 1,000 feet high were advancing across this whole region. So this is a huge ice sheet that was advancing across this region 55,000 years ago. And then it started to retreat. And around 18,000 years ago, it retreated from present-day Ohio and left behind these lakes, not the lakes that we know today as the Great Lakes, but different lakes that were in a different shape at that time. So as those glaciers retreated, it left sort of shorelines. You can imagine that, like when any lake dries up, it leaves a shoreline behind. And you can also see some of the sediment that was on the bottom of the old lake. So as these glaciers retreated, it left one shoreline here, and then it retreated a little bit more on another shoreline, another shoreline, and so on until we get to this blue line here. This is the old lakeshore of what is known as Lake Warren. And Lake Warren existed somewhere around 15,000 years ago. The water receded into what is present-day Lake Erie, leaving behind this area we know as the oak openings. So the reason it's got such sandy soils and the reason it's got these kind of swales and dunes is because this was the old lakeshore that is left over from that previous glacial period. Today, though, what can we see? How do we know we're in the oak openings region? Well, we know by looking at the communities that are here, and they are telling us what the geological history is, but also they're very rare and unique because of this geological history. One of the most common is oak savanna. This is kind of your classic oak openings habitat, where you have a big oak tree or a series of oak trees with big spaces in between, with wildflowers and grasses in between. Oak savannas are maintained by both natural fire, and when Native Americans were here, the Native Americans lit fires and they maintained these oak savannas. And at the time of European settlement, there were about 43% of the oak openings was in this oak savanna habitat. Trees with scattered flowers and grasses in between. Another previously common and very important habitat type or community type of the oak openings region is the Lake Plain wet prairie. Lake Plain referencing that old Lake Warren lakeshore, and prairies are like grasslands, but these get awfully wet and they can have standing water up to 2 feet. Sometimes more. The plants you might find in here include twig rush, different grasses and sedges, fringed gentian, dense blazing star, northern blue flag iris. If you're familiar with the region, Sylvan Prairie in Northwest Ohio is a very good example, one of the best remaining examples of intact wet prairie. And at the time of European settlement, there was about 27% of wet prairie in the oak openings region. This is from a 2004 paper that was published. Another oak openings community type, which is emblematic of this area, are oak woodlands. A lot of us are used to walking through the woods and being in oak woodlands. This is sort of like an oak savanna, but it's closed in a little bit more. Less space between the oak trees and the scattered trees. There's still fire that would maintain this type of ecosystem, but not as frequent as something you'd find like in an oak savanna that would keep the woody plant out much more in much more regular fire. Another type of community type that we find in the oak openings are oak barrens. This is also a sort of a classic oak opening community. It has rich biodiversity, lots of plants and animals here, rich soils. There tend to be white and black oaks, different wildflowers. Like we have here, plains puccoon is the yellow flower, and wild blue lupin is the blue flower. That's the host plant for the Karner blue butterfly, a very rare species that we have in the region. And another one, which is extremely rare, a globally vulnerable ecosystem type or community type, is known as the Midwest sand barren. Here you have actual exposed sand where you can be walking and see true sand dunes in the middle of Ohio and Michigan. So it's pretty unique. When you're standing here, it might feel like you're on the beach, but you're actually on an old lake bed, and you'll find things here that you'll find nowhere else, like prickly pear cactus. I mean, where else can you go to find cactus other than such a dry, maybe out west, but other than such a dry community? So examples of this include the Kitty Todd Preserve, where I work. Our offices are, and our headquarters is at the Kitty Todd Nature Preserve in Swanton, Ohio. But you can also find examples of these in the Toledo Metro Parks, like in the Oak Openings Metro Park. And I know of some other locations that have this Midwest sand barren in Michigan. One is up in Sumter Township, and I just found another one that's in Ida Township. So they are there, but they're very hard to find there, and most of them have been developed. And lastly is another very pretty type of community type known as the Mesic sand tallgrass prairie. You'll have things in here like black-eyed Susans, brown-eyed Susans, Monarda or bee balm, which is in the front. Some of the Silphium plants, different little blue stem, big blue stem, things like that you would expect to find in a tallgrass prairie. So unfortunately, we've lost almost all of these habitats. And overall, we've lost, in the oak openings region, we've lost 99% of the wet prairies. We've lost 98% or more of the oak savannas in Ohio, and greater than 90% of the oak savannas in Michigan. So a lot of what we do at the Nature Conservancy and our partners, and I want to credit a lot of our partners, like the ones that are on here now, Tomahawk Archers, Michigan United Conservation Clubs, Crosswinds Marsh, Wayne County, Metro Parks Toledo. We work with a lot of different organizations in the region to try to restore some of these lost habitats. So what do we do? How do we do that? How do we restore some of these communities that have been lost? And why were they lost? Well, one of the reasons they were lost is because a lot of this habitat has been turned to agriculture. Others of these have been turned into cities. Others have been drained, either for development or for agriculture as well. So when you mess around with the plant community and you mess around with the water table and you drain it out, you really rob the oak openings communities of their natural vegetation, their natural water cycle. So one thing we do is agricultural conversion. We're doing this on our Kitty Todd Preserve right now. We just purchased a 280-acre farm right adjacent to our Kitty Todd Preserve. And we are converting that as we speak. The bulldozers are, if they're not out there today, they'll be out there on Monday. They're trying to recreate a sand dune type of ecosystem on this property, where about 80% of the property is going to be wetland, and about 20% of the property is going to be sand dune and sand barren, or something kind of in between where it's a little drier. So you're going to have this, that's very unique to the oak openings. You're going to have this swale and dune type topography. So we're hoping it'll look something like this. I believe this picture was taken at the Sylvan Prairie, which is part of the tops the Olander Park system in Sylvania. And this is a great example of a restored prairie with a lot of help. And we do invasive species removal. We've helped with native seedings. It takes a lot of work to get a farmland to look like this again, but it's worth it. And we're trying to restore it to what it once was. One thing that is really important in the oak openings is fire. Unfortunately, we don't have nearly as much natural fire as we used to. There were natural fires that were started by lightning and fires created by Native Americans. Today, we don't have that as much, so we have to do our best and we use prescribed fire. Right now, the Nature Conservancy in Ohio is not burning as much as we would like to for logistical reasons, but we hope to get back to a stage soon where we can do prescribed fire. The oak openings region is evolved to have fire, so this really does need to be part of the equation if we're really going to do a good job restoring oak openings communities. Invasive plant control is what I spend most of my time on, and the people that I work with spend most of our time on. This is a picture of the Cutie Todd Preserve. This is, we have glossy buckthorn on the left, one of our real big top 10 invasive plant species from Europe and Asia. Other invasive plants that we deal with include autumn olive, bittersweet, oriental bittersweet, bush honeysuckles, garlic mustard. There's so many. There's just so much work being done right now on controlling invasive plants, and the plants just don't stop coming. I just heard a story. I think somebody just told me that some enormous crazy number, like 14 new invasive species are introduced to the United States I think it was either every day or every week. It's terrifying how often new invasive plants are being introduced into the United States, and they're really wreaking havoc on the oak openings communities. So a lot of what we do is controlling these things. Here on the left, you see uncontrolled glossy buckthorn, and on the right, you see an area where we've done a lot of work through removal of invasives and fire. And you see the plants are blooming, the cardinal flower is blooming, the sedges and rushes are coming up. This is what the area and oak opening community should look like. Scattered trees. This is a good example of an oak savanna. Scattered trees with grasses and forbs and flowers in between. So I'll talk more about our restoration techniques in a bit. Another thing we do is native plantings. This is our crew last year planting blazing stars for the Blazing Star Borer Moth. The blazing star is the host plant for the Blazing Star Borer Moth. By the way, feel free to interrupt if I can't see the chat. Brittany, please let me know if there are any questions. Feel free to take yourself off mute. I don't really want to lecture. It's not my favorite style. If you guys want to make it more conversational, I would love to. I would love your company. So this is our crew last year. Killian and Aaron are putting in some blazing stars at West Prairie. If any of you are familiar with the Southeast Michigan Land Conservancy, this is up on West Road, and they have a beautiful prairie up there. It's about 25 acres, I think. And we planted a few hundred blazing stars there last year. And again, this is the blazing stars are the host plant for the Blazing Star Borer Moth. So I'm going to talk now about this moth. I'm going to tell you more about its situation, why we're spending so much time on it. This is the adult phase of the Blazing Star Borer Moth. I am not a moth expert. Actually, I'm an ornithologist by trade. My background is academic research on grassland birds. So I have a lot to learn about moths. So if there's any lepidopterists on the line, please speak up. I find it very interesting that these two moths look different to me. This one has a kind of a fuzzy back, and this one doesn't, but is very black. These are, according to the folks that we work with at the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, which is part of Michigan State Extension. These are both adult Blazing Star Borer Moths. And these pictures were taken in Michigan last year. Actually, the one on the right was last year. The one on the left might have been in a previous year, but these were taken at some of our restoration sites that we work on. Up here, I just found this on the internet because it's pretty hard to find a picture of the actual caterpillar or larva of the Blazing Star Borer Moth, but this is the little caterpillar of it. So the life cycle looks something like this. The adult moth flies around in September and they look for other adults to mate with. The females find a blazing star plant and lay their eggs on or near a blazing star plant. Then they will overwinter there. So they'll either overwinter on the plant itself, but often they'll fall to the soil and they'll just be sitting in the soil all over winter long. That's why it's important for some of these species, the moth and other rare butterflies and moths, to have good snowpack, because that actually insulates the soil and insulates these little eggs and from the harsh weather. If we don't have good snowpack, then some of the eggs are exposed to harsher conditions. And then in the spring, this egg emerges into this little caterpillar. The caterpillar, its first job and pretty much only job in life is to go find a blazing star plant, and then it will feed on the blazing star plant for the remainder of the summer, getting bigger and bigger, going through different sizes known as instars. And then at some point, I believe in August or September, it'll go through, it'll pupate, which means to turn into an adult. So it'll go through the pupa stage, and then out will come a adult blazing star borer moth, and the cycle begins again. So I find it interesting and very interesting how the moth has its life cycle, and it's important that we know this life cycle so that we can restore things at so that it has the plants it needs and the habitat it needs at different stages of its life cycle.
Pete, I was actually curious, would you happen to know if that picture you just left, do you think that that's a male versus a female?
I think it might be. Brittany, that's a great question. I'm gonna ask Dave Cothrell, who's our contact at Michigan State, if that's the case. I think that's an excellent guess. That actually rings a bell. Now that you say that rings a bell. But I do not know. I do know that one of the ways, the easier ways to find the moth in the fall is to look for that fuzzy patch. I think this morph is more commonly seen rather than this morph. But I'll get back to you on that, Brittany. That's a great question.
Yeah, I know typically with butterflies and moths, it's not uncommon to have the males and females look different.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And the caterpillar there is pretty small. I don't think the caterpillar is seen very often by many people. I mean, even the moth, this is a moth smaller than an inch, and it's only found in a couple weeks in September, only found in a very rare, a few places. So just finding them, even the adult moth, is hard, let alone the caterpillar. Okay, so this is the distribution that is listed on the Michigan Natural Features Inventory website for the Blazing Star Borer Moth, currently located in a few counties in the south part of Michigan, very few going up into the northern part of the lower peninsula, and then none in the upper peninsula. I don't have a map for the for Ohio. I don't know if one exists actually, but I can tell you that it's not as common in Ohio as it is in Michigan. And one of the reasons for that is that there's this guy, Dave Cothrell, who's studying this moth at Michigan State. If it weren't for him, we wouldn't know very much about this, this species at all. So what are we doing with the Nature Conservancy to help this moth and other pollinators? Because as I said, we aren't just trying to help the moth. This is not only an indicator species, like if the moth is there, you might find other species as well, but like this is sort of this is the kind of species that if you see this species, it's probably telling you that there are other species of interest around. That might include things like grasshopper sparrows and tick thistles and savanna sparrows and different rare grassland birds, or other rare butterflies or moths. So we're working in a whole bunch of areas in the oak openings region. Again, this polygon is the oak openings region. If you're at all not familiar with the region, this is Lake Erie here. You have the Maumee River here and the Detroit River here. I live on Grosse Ile, which is right there, actually right here. And so we work right now we're working at these locations with purple dots. That's where we have planted blazing stars for the moth. And that's where, and the polygons around those areas are the properties where we're working. We are currently working on a grant that we got from the Fish and Wildlife Service to do 308 acres of restoration in this part of Michigan. And then we're also going to be planting 4,000 blazing stars of at least 2 different species of blazing stars, the dense blazing star, Laetrius Piccata, and the rough blazing star, Laetrius aspera. There are other blazing stars that are potentially host plants for the Blazing Star Borer Moth. But we think, along with Michigan State, that maybe those 2 that I mentioned are probably the most common host plants for the moth. We just put in a proposal also to the Fish and Wildlife Service to allow us to do more work in Michigan, but also expand our work into Ohio. That proposal is to do 350 distinct acres of restoration work in Ohio and Michigan, and plant another 4,000 blazing stars. And that proposal is going to be heavily, if we get funded, and we should find out here in the next few weeks. So we're all crossing our fingers in the Oak Openings office. We'll be working with Metro Parks Toledo on that project if we get that grant. Here is just a zoomed in shot of where we are working currently in Michigan. So we have Petersburg State Game Area down here. This is where we did a planting day with Michigan United Conservation Clubs. We are doing work in Sumter Township on Arcona Road. We're doing work in the ITC power corridor not far from Crosswinds Marsh. And we're doing work at West Prairie at the Southeast Michigan Land Conservancy and a few other private properties in this region. So that's where we're working currently. These circles are 5-mile radius circles. And the reason we have those on there is that the folks at Michigan State tell us that they estimate that the dispersal distance of an adult blazing star borer moth is about 5 miles. So we're trying to concentrate our efforts and our restoration work around known blazing star sites and open up new habitat within the dispersal distance of the moth. So these green dots are where we're working, and these white circles are where we potentially could work under the next grant or future grants to open up new habitat, assuming that the moth can disperse and reach those new habitats, because it wouldn't make a lot of sense if we did restoration work really far from a known location where they might not be able to find a new restoration site with more blazing stars. So we're giving that consideration as well. Blazing stars, I've talked about,
So kind of going back to that last PowerPoint. So my thought process for, I don't know if you guys have reached out or not, but have you talked to the Huron-Clinton Metro Parks?
Yes, and in fact, my apologies for not saying this today. We are just today, I had a crew of 4 people out doing work at Oakwoods Metro Park. We're doing probably, I don't know the actual acreage of work that we're doing on the Blazing Star Borer Moth grant. We have another grant with the Southeast Michigan Land Conservancy, with the Southeast Michigan Resilience Fund to do lots of work at Oakwoods Metro Park. We are working with as many partners as we have in the region. Wayne County is an example. Huron-Clinton is an example. Southeast Michigan Land Conservancy, another example. Any place where there is good potential blazing star borer moth habitat. So that means it needs to be open. These are not, blazing stars don't grow in the middle of the woods, and the moth doesn't fly in the middle of the woods either. So they need to be open access areas. And if we have potential partners, we would love to work with them. So the answer is yes. we're working, not only are we working with them, we work there today, we're working there tomorrow, and we'll be working there a lot during the summer.
Nice. So that kind of leads me into a second question, just because I can't tell with this map right now. Do you know if the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge happens to land in that rightmost circle?
I do know that it does not. It's up here because I live up here, and
Oh.
I don't know exactly how far the refuge goes. I'm not sure if this little point is on an island or on a, that might be actually on Grosse Ile. So so these islands here may be part of the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge. It's not a hard and fast rule that we have to stay within 5 miles. We will work, if we think that there are good oak openings habitats nearby the region, and we think that it's a potential for to restore, we may work with those partners. I'm showing you this one because this is the map we put in our proposal to the Fish and Wildlife Service of where we want to concentrate our work, but we're certainly not limiting ourselves to only working here. These are just kind of the places we think that have the highest potential to improve habitat for the moth and other species.
I see. Yeah, well, I know they have been doing work at the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge. I know they just opened up the visitor center.
I know.
Yes, that's exciting. They finally have that open. Which we actually have an event with them next Saturday.
Oh, really?
Yeah, teaching about invasive species across international borders.
Well, that's interesting. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that. Yes. I'm not, it might be a potential to work with them either on this grant or future grants. And we love partnering. We can't do our work without our partners. In this whole oak openings region, the only property that we have that's Nature Conservancy property is the Kitty Todd Nature Preserve, which is 1,400 acres. But I mentioned this is a 130 square mile region. We work on dozens of different properties. Only one of them is TNC property. So we love partnering. We need to partner with agencies. And Brittany, I'll talk to you more about that, but that's a great thought.
Yeah, definitely. We'll talk later.
And I'm excited to go to the visitor center. I was just out there 2 weeks ago and looking at some cool birds like dick thistles in the parking lot there. And this winter I had my first Lapland longspur there. So I was excited. I love that refuge and I'm excited to get to know it better.
Yeah, maybe you'll join us on next Saturday.
Okay, I'll talk to you more. So I mentioned the blazing stars, the rough blazing stars on the left. That's Laetrius aspera. The right is a picture on Kitty Todd of dense blazing star, which is Laetrius Piccata. Other blazing stars that might be host plants for the moth include northern blazing star, which is Laetrius scariosa, and scaly blazing star, which is Laetrius squarosa. I actually just saw my first northern blazing star last week on a private property in Michigan, where we're doing restoration. So that was encouraging. How do we do this? How do we take a property and how do we actually restore an area for a species like the Blazing Star Borer Moth? Well, we use a lot of techniques. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of what we do is dealing with invasive plants. We would love to do more prescribed fire when we get the opportunity, but right now we're using other tools in our toolbox. So what are those tools? One is our Forestry Mower. The Forestry Mower is actually the attachment in the front of this bobcat, which is here. So this actually comes off and on. This thing whirls around. It's a crazy attachment. It's the most crazy thing I may have ever seen. It spins around. This thing can take out whole trees. It's got these wedges on the front that will just clobber anything in its path. We are literally mowing down the forest. This is a patch of glossy buckthorn. There is also some autumn olive in here. What we do when we find areas that are all entirely dominated by invasive plants, non-native plants, we'll break out this machine and we'll mow it down because we need to start over. We need to kind of reset the successional timeline and get some of these out of there and then find other ways to encourage the native plants to get a foothold again because they've been overrun by invasives. So we use our forestry mower in the densest locations. And after we're done with it, it looks pretty open, but it'll grow back quickly. And what we do then is try to select for the native plants as best we can. Another technique is brush cutting. So we'll use a brush cutter here, like this one, that's similar to a weed whacker, but it's got a steel blade on the bottom of it. We'll take out small to mid-sized trees with brush cutters. We'll take out vines like bittersweet with it. And then we'll always treat the stump with herbicide so that that non-native invasive plant doesn't come back. Herbicide application, we do a lot of backpack spraying. That's what we were doing today at Oakwoods Metro Park. And so we are using the proper herbicides and very carefully applying them to invasive plants only in these types of habitats, trying to get rid of things like glossy buckthorn and the other really bad invasives. And I believe this picture actually was taken at the Sylvan Prairie. Yeah, it says that down in the corner. This was last year's field crew. These are the backpacks we use. If you're not familiar with this technique, we fill it with a mixture of herbicide and water, and we use the blue dye to help us figure out where we've sprayed. And we use all of our technicians are licensed pesticide applicators. Okay, so that's what we've done to clear out the invasives. So imagine you had a property that is just dominated by invasive plants. We'll use some of those techniques to clear it out. Then what do we do to help the Blazing Star Borer Moth? Well, in this case, we're planting. So the planting process starts with taking seeds that were collected, in this case by our friends at Blue Creek Nursery at the Metro Parks Toledo Blue Creek Metro Park. These are folks at Blue Creek Metro Park that are helping us out and seeding these little trays with starts for blazing stars. In this case, I think they're planting the dense blazing star, the Laetrius Piccata. So once they're in those little trays, they'll go to cold storage and they'll stay in. They're planted usually around January. Actually, this year they were planted, I believe, on January 2nd because we plant them early each year, and hopefully if we get the next grant, we'll continue this process. Planting in early January, they go into cold storage and they stay in cold storage until about, June or July. Then they come out and they look like this. They're about 2 to 4 inches high, and we either have volunteers or in this case, we have our staff that repot them because they were in those little trays, those little cells. And they're now too small. At this stage in the game, they're too big for those little cells. So we repot them and put them into bigger pots. And then we put them back into storage for a while and let them grow a little bit more. And then come September, they look something like this. This is the Laetrius Piccata, the dense blazing stars. This is several hundred that are being ready to go out for planting. So we put those in our trucks. We go to our planting sites and we put them in the ground. We take our shovels, we take our axes, pickaxes, whatever we can open the ground with, make a little depression, put them in there. And here we're planting at West Prairie, that's owned again by Southeast Michigan Land Conservancy. This is the planting day with the Michigan United Conservation Clubs. This was done at Petersburg State Game Area last September. Actually, this one was October. We really appreciate their help. We had 20 people come out that day and we got about 400 plants in the ground in just a few hours. So some help. Brittany and I were talking about another planting day coming up that we'd love anybody's help with, coming up at Crosswinds Marsh this fall. We have another planting day at Petersburg State Game Area. If anybody that is on the call today, or if anybody who you can think of would like to help, we can use the help. We have another 2,000 to plant this fall. We also go through, so this was actually taken at the ITC corridor near Crosswinds. And once we've planted them, this was a big planting day we did at the ITC corridor. We also water them. So in this case, we're just using our backpack sprayers, but we're just spraying them and keeping them nice and moist until the first freeze. And And then they should be able to overwinter fine. And we've had good success. I went out and looked at our Blazing Star plantings from last year, and a lot of them are blooming right now. So lastly, probably one of the most interesting things about this project is that we're not just doing restoration and we're not just doing planting, but we're also doing surveys for the moth and for other borer moth species as well. So here's Dave Cottrell from the Michigan Natural Features Inventory. Here's one of our technicians, Paul, and my wife, Erin, and we are out with Michigan State doing blacklight surveys at one of our restoration sites. So this isn't always the case. It's not always the case that we get the opportunity to do sort of full circle conservation where we do restoration, we do monitoring, and we do planting. But this is really great that this project allows us to do all those things. On this particular night, we found the borer moth, and we found the Blazing Star Borer Moth at all 6 of the restoration sites that we worked at last year. That's a really strong indication that our restoration is working. This year, we're really excited to find out if the planting that we did last fall, if we're going to see an increase in abundance of Blazing Star Borer Moths at the same sites this year. So we can study both the presence of the moth and the abundance of the moth with this technique of black lighting. And Dave has specialized methods that allow him to keep track of the abundance and measure the abundance standard over different nights. Another thing that Dave is doing is studying the dispersal of the moth. I mentioned earlier that the dispersal distance is estimated to be at about 5 miles. Well, that's because Dave will collect these moths, and he also has a colleague, Logan, who does this. And they'll go and they'll capture the moths, and they'll actually put a little blue or red or green dye on the moth and then release them at different distances. And then at different times during the night, they'll check the sheet here, and they'll see how long it took for the moth to get back to the sheet if it's released at different distances, like 50 meters or 100 meters away from the sheet. Now, of course, a lot of them aren't going to go back to the sheet, so a lot of the ones that get marked and tagged don't come back, but some of them do. And based on the speed with which they come back, he's been able to estimate their dispersal over a given night